The river was swollen with spring melt, its current tugging at the banks as though it meant to pull the whole town into its restless arms, and Sarah knelt low in the reeds, her hands raw from hauling buckets. She thought at first the sound was a bird, thin, shrill, insistent. But when she turned, squinting through the sunlight bouncing off the water, she saw the cradle. It rocked and spun in the current, a crooked wooden thing patched together from pine and rag rope, and inside, something moved beneath a damp scrap of quilt. Her heart clutched as she waded in, the icy water biting through her skirts, lifting her legs off balance. She lunged, catching the cradle against her chest, almost going under with it before stumbling back onto the mud. The cry was unmistakable now, weak but alive, and when she peeled back the quilt, she saw a baby, face red from screaming, fists clenched like little stones. For a moment, Sarah just knelt there, dripping, the whole world gone still except for that fragile wail, and a thought she wasn't ready for whispered across her mind. This child came to me. Her neighbors had always spoken low around her, pity or mockery in their eyes. Barren woman, cursed woman, too thin, too cold, no man lasting beside her more than a season. They said a woman who couldn't give life had no right to claim it. She had borne that silence and that shame year after year until she learned to keep her head down at the edge of town. And now here was life itself, thrust into her hands by the river as if heaven meant to shame them all. She clutched the child close, murmuring against its wet hair, feeling the frantic rise and fall of its chest, smelling the river and the sour tang of fear mixed with something sweeter. Milk. Faint but familiar. She didn't even question what she must do. She wrapped the baby in her shawl and held it as if it had always been hers. By the time she staggered back toward the road, a cart was rattling past. The driver slowed, staring, and his wife gasped loud enough to carry. Sarah heard the whisper before they were even gone. She stole it. Her jaw set hard. She walked on, each step heavier with the weight of what she knew the town would say. By the time she reached her small cabin, the bell from the church tower was ringing noon, and already 3 women stood at her gate, faces pinched and eager. One pointed. That's not hers. She doesn't bear children. Another hissed, "Where did you take it from, Sarah?" She didn't answer. She only pushed through them, clutching the bundle close until the baby calmed enough to whimper instead of wail. Inside, she laid the cradle by the hearth, the damp quilt steaming as the fire caught. She could hardly take her eyes off the child. The weight in her chest was both terrifying and electric, as though she had swallowed fire. She whispered a name without meaning to, Hope, and the baby stirred as if answering. But her quiet was broken by the thud of boots outside. She froze, listening. The sheriff's voice called low but firm, "Sarah, come out!" The hair on her arms prickled. She knew this was only the beginning, that the child was not just hers to hold without question. She tightened her grip on the shawl and kissed the baby's temple, bracing herself as she turned toward the door, knowing what awaited was not mercy, but judgment. The sheriff stood with his hands heavy on his belt, the noon sun catching the silver on his badge until it shone like a warning. Behind him, half the town had gathered, whispers knotting together into a chorus of suspicion. Sarah stepped into the doorway with the baby pressed to her chest, her shoulders squared, though her knees shook beneath her skirts. The sheriff's eyes narrowed when he saw the cradle set by the fire inside. His voice was calm, but edged with authority. "Sarah, folks say you've taken something that wasn't yours." He gestured toward the bundle. "I need to know where that child came from." Her throat tightened, words clumsy in her mouth, but she forced them out. "The river brought her. I pulled her out before the current took her under. I swear it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp as stones. One woman called out, "The river doesn't deliver babies, Sarah." Another added, "She's spinning lies again." The sheriff raised a hand to quiet them, but his gaze still carried doubt. Sarah clutched the baby tighter, feeling the rise and fall of its tiny ribs, as if proving to herself it was alive, real, not some trick she had imagined. The crowd pressed closer, anger swelling with their fear. A man spat on the ground. "We ought to take that child to the church, let the reverend decide. She doesn't deserve to keep it." The sheriff's jaw flexed. "Sarah, you know how this looks. Folks remember your past." The words cut deep, reopening every wound she had carried in silence. She wanted to scream that she hadn't stolen anything, that she had bled enough under their judgment. But instead she whispered, steady as she could, "She came to me because no one else was there, and now she's mine." The crowd erupted again, voices colliding until one low voice cut across them like an axe. "Leave her be!" Heads turned. A figure had stepped from the edge of the group, tall and broad-shouldered, hat pulled low against the sun. He was a cowboy few spoke to, quiet as stone, his past as weathered as the scar running from his cheek to his jaw. He walked forward, each step measured, until he stood before the sheriff. His eyes dropped to the baby, then to the quilt that wrapped her. He froze, the breath catching in his chest. "I know that blanket," he said, voice rough as gravel. "My wife stitched it." The words silenced the crowd like a sudden storm. The sheriff frowned, uncertain. The cowboy stepped closer, gaze locked on the quilt's faded stitching, his hand trembling before he lowered it again. "She died 2 winters ago, but I'd know her work anywhere." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time his voice softened. "This child, she's meant to be here." The sheriff shifted uneasily, torn between law and something larger than law. The murmurs rose again, half in protest, half in awe, as if the river itself had conspired. Sarah felt her breath return in a rush, though her fear still clung like ice. She hadn't expected rescue, hadn't asked for it, and yet this man's words held weight no one could deny. The baby stirred, a small sound in the hush, and the cowboy's eyes glistened with something unspoken, something raw. The sheriff exhaled slow. "We'll see what truth comes with time," he muttered. "But for now..." He looked at the cowboy, then at Sarah, then turned back to the crowd. "For now she keeps the child." Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she stood firm. The crowd muttered in discontent, yet no one stepped forward. The cowboy gave her a small nod, steady, like a promise she didn't yet understand. And as the townsfolk drifted away, Sarah knew this moment had tied her fate to his, in ways neither of them could yet name. Sarah sat by the fire long after the crowd had dispersed, her body trembling though the cabin was warm. The baby slept soundly in the cradle, tiny fists curled tight, her breath soft as feathers. Sarah traced the quilt with her fingers, the same one that had silenced the mob, every stitch a shield she hadn't earned. She couldn't shake the image of the cowboy's face when he recognized it, the grief that cracked his voice, the way his eyes had filled with something close to reverence. It haunted her almost as much as the sheriff's doubt. The door creaked open. Sarah startled, clutching the baby to her chest, but it was only him, the scarred cowboy. He lingered in the doorway as if unsure he belonged inside. His hat was in his hand, his shoulders heavy with a weight she could almost feel. She whispered, "You shouldn't be here. If they see you..." He shook his head slowly. "They already saw enough. You wouldn't be standing if I hadn't spoken." His gaze dropped to the cradle, then to the quilt. His voice roughened. "That belonged to my wife, Anna." Sarah's throat tightened. "I didn't steal it," she said quickly, her words spilling fast. "I found her, the baby, in the river, wrapped just like this. I thought she'd drown. I didn't know it was yours." His eyes flickered, pain and something else stirring. He stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots, and touched the edge of the quilt with fingers that shook. "This pattern. Anna made it for the child we never had." His voice broke, and Sarah felt the truth lodge sharp in her chest. This child isn't just a child to him. She's a ghost of what he lost. She tried to speak, but the words tangled. Finally, she said, Maybe she was carried here for you. Maybe the river knew where to send her." His gaze snapped to hers, startled, almost angry, but behind it lay something fragile. "Don't speak like that," he muttered. "You don't know what you're saying." He turned away, fists clenched, shoulders rising and falling with unsteady breaths. Sarah held the baby tighter, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to wound him, only to ease the weight, but instead she had uncovered something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. The silence pressed thick until the baby stirred, whimpering, and Sarah rocked her gently. The cowboy's head turned, drawn like iron to a magnet. He stepped closer again, this time slower, more hesitant, and for the first time since he entered, his eyes softened. "She looks nothing like Anna," he whispered. "But when she breathes, it feels the same." Sarah caught her breath, hearing in his words both love and danger, the love that could heal and the danger of being consumed by memory. "You can hold her," Sarah said before she could stop herself. His eyes widened, his scar seeming sharper in the firelight. I shouldn't." But she lifted the baby anyway, offering her forward. His hands hovered, reluctant, before he finally took the child, cradling her with a gentleness that belied the strength in his arms. The baby sighed, nestling against him as if she had known him all along. His lips pressed tight, his eyes glimmered, and for a moment the scarred man looked like a husband again, not a ghost walking. Sarah watched, both relieved and afraid. If this child bound her fate, it also bound his. She didn't know if it would save them or destroy them, but as the fire crackled and the baby rested in his arms, she knew their lives had been tangled beyond unraveling. By morning, the town's whispers had thickened into a rope around Sarah's neck. She felt it when she stepped onto the porch, the way faces turned, mouths half hidden by hands, suspicion riding the wind sharper than any winter chill. A woman in the street hissed, "I told you that baby weren't hers, not with that quilt." Another spat in the dirt, muttering, "She's hiding something." Sarah clutched the child close and forced her eyes down, but the shame pressed heavy. Every step, every stare reminded her how fragile her place in this town was. Inside the cabin, she tried to steady herself, rocking the baby, humming soft to drown out the voices. But her chest tightened when hooves clattered outside and boots struck the porch. The door opened without a knock. Sheriff Holden stood framed in daylight, his broad frame casting a shadow that stretched long across the floor. His eyes narrowed, moving from Sarah to the cradle, to the quilt folded neatly across its edge. He said flatly, "We need to talk." Sarah swallowed hard. "About what?" she asked, though she knew. Holden stepped in, his spurs clicking against the boards. "You came here with nothing. No husband, no family. Now you've got a baby and a quilt everyone knows belonged to Anna Briggs. You see my problem?" Sarah's voice trembled. "I told you, I found her in the river. I didn't steal her." He studied her face for a long, cold moment, then said, "That cowboy last night, Colt Briggs, he claimed the child like blood of his blood." Her stomach dropped. "Claimed? He never said that. He just..." Holden cut her off. Doesn't matter what words he used. Folks believe what they want. And what they want is that you're lying. Sarah's hands shook as she adjusted the baby against her shoulder. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. I only wanted her safe. The sheriff's gaze softened for a flicker of a second, but then he pulled it back, jaw hardening. If you're telling the truth, girl, you'd best find a way to prove it. If not— He didn't finish, but the weight of his silence pressed harder than his words. After he left, Sarah sank to her knees beside the cradle, her breath coming ragged. Prove it. How could she prove a river's mercy? Tears stung her eyes, but she bit them back, pressing her lips to the baby's head. You're mine, she whispered fiercely. I may not have borne you, but I'll fight for you. She hadn't realized until that moment how much the child had become a part of her, how much losing her now would tear open wounds deeper than she could bear. The door creaked again, and she startled. But it was Colt Briggs, scarred face lined with exhaustion. He glanced at her crumpled on the floor, then at the baby, then away. They came to me this morning, he said, voice low. Told me to claim her proper, marry you, make it neat. His words landed like blows. Sarah stared, heart hammering. Marry me? His shoulders lifted in a weary shrug. Better than letting them take her from you. Her mind spun. Was this salvation, or another kind of prison? She looked at him, at the scar, the sorrow in his eyes, the strength he didn't know he still carried. She whispered, And what do you want, Colt? His jaw tightened. I want to keep her safe, and I can't do that alone. Sarah's heart twisted. The room felt suddenly too small, the baby's breaths too loud, the fire too sharp. Outside, the whispers grew louder, circling like vultures. And inside, she realized she was standing at the edge of a choice that would decide all their fates. Sarah stood frozen, Colt's words rattling inside her like loose stones. Marry you. The fire popped in the hearth, but its warmth did not reach her. She clutched the baby tighter, her heart beating against the child's small frame. The whispers outside swelled, faint but sharp, like knives tapping glass. She lifted her eyes to Colt, his face half in shadow, scar cutting across the tired lines of a man who had carried more grief than she could fathom. She tried to find her voice. You don't know me. I don't know you. Marriage isn't something you barter like wheat or cattle. Colt leaned his hand on the doorframe, heavy, as though the weight of the whole town pressed through his shoulders. They won't leave you be, Sarah. The sheriff, the gossips, the judge. Sooner or later, they'll take her. His gaze flicked to the baby. This way, she stays. Sarah's breath caught. He spoke of the child like she was already his, like this fragile life had wound him into a knot with her own. But doubt flared hot. You're saying this for her, not for me. Colt's jaw tightened, eyes hardening. Maybe so. But tell me you wouldn't do the same. Tell me you'd watch them tear her from your arms because you were too proud to bind yourself to someone you don't trust yet. His voice cracked on the word trust, like it was a foreign shape on his tongue. Sarah's chest ached. She thought of nights spent hungry, winters endured with nothing but threadbare hope, and how this tiny bundle had filled an emptiness she hadn't realized had been waiting all along. To lose her now, she couldn't. But binding herself to a man she barely knew, one the town pitied and feared in equal measure. Her body shook under the weight of it. Colt stepped closer, kneeling, his massive hands careful as he reached toward the baby. She shifted, but his touch was feather-light against the quilt, reverent. When he spoke, his voice was lower, softer. I don't have much left to give. My land's half-starved, my name's worth less. But I've got two good hands, a roof that holds, and I won't run when trouble comes." He lifted his eyes, pain swimming in them. "That's all I can promise." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing, staring at him, trying to see past the scar, past the bitterness that clung to him like smoke. She wondered if somewhere under all that ruin there was a man who once knew how to laugh. She whispered, "And what if I say no?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Then you'll be alone. And they'll come for her." The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, the sound slicing through the silence like a plea. Sarah pressed her lips against the tiny forehead, closing her eyes. She thought of every night she'd prayed for belonging, for someone who might look at her and not see emptiness. When she opened her eyes again, she felt the decision forming before she even spoke. "I'll do it," she said, the words tasting like surrender and defiance all at once. "But not because they say so, not because you think it's neat. I'll do it for her, for this child." Colt's shoulders sagged, relief breaking through his hard edges. He nodded once, solemn. "Then we'll speak it before the judge tomorrow." Sarah's breath shook as she realized the path had been laid, narrow and rough, but there was no turning back. The baby gurgled, tiny fingers curling around hers, sealing the vow before the law ever could. The courthouse smelled of dust and old pine, the air heavy with the weight of every verdict ever spoken within its walls. Sarah stood stiffly at Colt's side, her hands trembling inside the frayed sleeves of her dress as she held the baby against her chest. The town had gathered outside, murmurs swelling like a hive of restless bees, their curiosity dragging them from shops and porches to see what scandal would unfold. Inside, Judge Caro sat high in his chair, his lined face carved into stone. He squinted down at Colt with something between pity and disdain. Colt Walker. He leaned back, tapping his cane against the floor. "Thought I'd seen the last of you in here after that business with the land boundary. And now," he let his eyes slide to Sarah, narrowing. "You come here asking to make this girl your wife." Colt's jaw was locked, but his voice carried steady. "I don't ask favors, Judge, just the right for a woman and her child to be left alone. Marriage gives that." Caro snorted, his gaze lingering on Sarah like he was weighing her worth. "You bring a stranger into this town, a child not of your blood, and expect folks to accept it because you stand here with papers?" He leaned forward, cane tapping again. "Do you love her, Colt?" The question stung like a whip. Sarah's throat tightened. She looked at Colt, half expecting him to flinch, but his face stayed rigid, eyes fixed on the judge. "I'll protect her," he said. "That's all a man like me can promise." Gasps whispered from the back of the room. Protection, not love. Sarah's cheeks burned. She wanted to speak, to tell them it wasn't protection she craved, but belonging, a place where the baby's cries wouldn't be met with whispers of shame. But the words caught, her tongue heavy with the fear of saying too much. Judge Caro studied her now, his eyes, sharp as needles, bored into her chest. "And you, girl, do you bind yourself to a man who can barely lift his head when your name is spoken?" His scar, his silence, these are heavy chains. Do you know what you're doing? Sarah shifted the baby higher in her arms, feeling the fragile heartbeat against her own. Her voice came quiet but sure, though it shook at the edges. "I know enough. I know no one else in this room offered a hand when I needed it. I know this child won't survive on whispers and pity, and I know a man's worth isn't written on his scars." The judge's eyes narrowed further, but his cane stilled. Silence hung, thick and brittle, until the gavel cracked the air. "Very well." His voice carried with reluctant authority. "If this is the road you choose, the law won't stand in your way. But don't think the town will walk it with you. Colt's hand flexed at his side, then slowly he reached for Sarah's arm, steadying her as though the weight of the town's stairs had pressed her to the floor. She allowed it, her body trembling but refusing to bow. The judge scrawled his name across the page, the scratch of the pen sealing what felt both like a bond and a sentence. When they stepped outside, the crowd scattered like leaves in the wind, but the echo of their whispers clung to Sarah's skin. Colt kept his hand near her back, guiding her through the street, his silence heavier than words. Sarah glanced down at the baby, who blinked at the sunlight, unaware of vows or judgment. She whispered against the child's hair, as much for herself as for her. "We belong somewhere, even if it's only here." Colt heard it, though she hadn't meant him to. His hand paused against her shoulder, the faintest tremor in his breath betraying something he hadn't said aloud. The street outside the courthouse felt colder than when they'd entered, though the sun had climbed higher in the sky. Sarah clutched the baby close, her ears ringing with the leftover murmurs of the crowd. Colt walked just half a step ahead, his body a shield, though his silence stretched like a wall she couldn't scale. They hadn't gone 20 yards before a man stepped from the line of storefronts, blocking their way. He was tall, shoulders squared with false confidence, his vest tight across a chest puffed by liquor more than courage. His name was Tanner Holt, a rancher's son with idle hands and a mouth that never knew kindness. "Well, well," Holt drawled, a smirk curving as he leaned on the butt of his rifle. "Thought I'd come see this spectacle for myself." "Judge signed his name, did he?" "Means nothing. You can call her wife all you like, but folks here won't see it that way." He spat into the dust, the sound sharp as a slap. "She'll always be the stray left begging at your door." Sarah's grip tightened on the baby until her knuckles ached. The child whimpered, feeling the tremor in her arms. Colt's shoulders stiffened, his hand hovering near his holster, but he didn't draw. His voice, low and rough, cut through Holt's sneer. "Move aside." Holt laughed, loud enough for shopkeepers and passers-by to pause in their tracks. "Or what? You'll stand there and scowl me into silence?" He pointed his chin at Sarah. "Look at her. Ragged dress, child in her arms that ain't yours, and you, scar-faced and broken, claiming her like she's a prize mule. Folks'll talk. I'll make sure of it." Sarah's throat burned. She wanted to shout, to tell Holt that her life wasn't his to mock, but fear gripped her tongue. It was Colt who moved first, not for his gun, but for his hat. He tipped it forward, shadowing his eyes, and stepped into Holt's space until their boots nearly touched. "You'll say your words once," Colt rasped, voice low enough that the air itself seemed to hush. "And then you'll be done." For the first time, Holt's smirk faltered. He shifted his weight, glancing to the small gathering crowd now watching with bated breath. A man's pride swelled in such moments, but Colt's stillness, the quiet certainty in his stance, gnawed at Holt's bravado. Holt spat again, but his voice carried less sure. "Won't last, Walker. Town'll chew you both up." Then he backed away, muttering curses as he pushed through the bystanders, leaving dust in his wake. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers weaving like smoke around them. Sarah exhaled shakily, realizing only then how close her knees had come to buckling. Colt turned, his scarred face unreadable, and touched her elbow. "Let's go," he said, softer than she expected. They walked in silence, past the blacksmith's clang and the saloon's open doors, until the town thinned into dirt road and prairie beyond. Sarah dared a glance at Colt, wanting to thank him, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon. His silence weighed heavy, yet she sensed the tension in him wasn't anger. It was restraint. As they neared the small cabin that waited on the edge of town, Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "You don't have to fight my battles for me. Colt stopped walking, turning his head slowly, his gaze steady on hers. His words came rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "Maybe not. But I'll never stand by and let a man break you down. Not while I breathe." The baby stirred in her arms, and Sarah swallowed hard, the sting of tears pushing against her composure. For the first time since she'd stepped into this town, she felt the ground beneath her feet steady. Not because the whispers had stopped, but because someone had chosen to stand beside her, no matter the cost. By the time the prairie swallowed the last glimpse of town, the weight of Holt's words still pressed on Sarah's chest like a stone. Colt walked ahead, long strides steady, but his silence was a wall she couldn't read. The baby had drifted into a fitful sleep, his small breath warm against her collarbone, but every creak of the wagon wheel or rustle of grass made Sarah flinch. She knew men like Holt. Words were never where it ended. The cabin came into view just as the sky turned copper and blue, the edges of dusk stretching across the horizon. It stood lonely against the land, logs weathered and roof patched in places where storms had tried to tear it apart. Colt opened the door without ceremony, stepping inside first. His eyes swept corners, his hand brushing against the butt of his pistol like instinct, before he finally waved her in. Sarah hesitated at the threshold. The cabin smelled of earth and smoke, the faintest hint of leather oil clinging to the air. Inside, the room was plain but solid. A single table scarred with years of use, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a hearth cold from neglect. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. She stepped across, whispering more to herself than anyone, "I'll make it warm." Colt set down his hat and coat without answering. His hands moved with quiet efficiency, striking flint, coaxing a flame into the waiting woodpile. Soon firelight crawled up the stone hearth, painting the walls gold and chasing shadows into corners. Sarah laid the baby in a basket she'd carried across 3 states, smoothing the worn blanket over his chest. For a moment, watching the tiny rise and fall of his breath, she felt almost safe. But safety was a fragile thing. The scrape of boots on gravel outside made her freeze. Colt's head snapped up, his body coiling tight. He moved to the window, lifting the curtain with 2 fingers just enough to peer out. Sarah's heart hammered as she whispered, "Is it Holt?" Colt didn't answer at once. His jaw flexed, the scar across his cheek pulling tight. Then he turned, his voice low and certain. "Stay inside." He crossed the room in 3 strides, snatched his rifle from its place against the wall, and slipped out the door into the deepening night. Sarah held her breath, clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles blanched. The silence stretched long, broken only by the pop of firewood. Then a voice carried through the dark. Holt's, sneering and mean. "You think you can bring her out here and hide? This land ain't yours to wall yourself off in. She don't belong here, and neither do you." Sarah's stomach twisted, her mind spinning. She glanced at the baby, sleeping unaware, and a fierce protectiveness rose in her chest. She wanted to run outside, to stand beside Colt, but fear pinned her feet. Instead, she strained to hear every sound. Colt's even reply, rough but unshaken. "You'll leave now." The sharp cock of a rifle echoed back. Sarah's breath caught, her body trembling as if the sound itself had struck her. Through the crack of the doorframe, she caught a glimpse of shadows moving. Holt wasn't alone. 2 men lingered behind him, their shapes blurred in the fading light. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth to smother a cry. She could feel the weight of choice pressing in. Stay hidden with the child, or step outside and face whatever storm had followed them here. Her whole body shook, torn between fear and the stubborn strength that had carried her across miles of road and ridicule. Outside, Colt's voice carried again, steady as stone. Last chance. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, a pause stretched thin as wire. Sarah knew the night was about to break. The night held its breath. Sarah pressed her back to the wall, the firelight behind her flickering low as if even the flames feared what waited outside. Her ears strained, every beat of her heart louder than the wind against the shutters. She could hear Holt's drawl, cruel and taunting, slithering through the air like a snake. "You don't scare me, Colt. Not you, not your cabin, not your pretty little runaway." Sarah's stomach knotted. He knew she was listening, knew every word would dig into her fear. She looked down at the baby, still asleep in the basket, blissfully unaware that shadows pressed closer to the door. She felt sick with helplessness, torn between hiding him deeper and running outside to stand beside Colt. Colt's reply came sharp, but not raised. "You want me, Holt? You look me in the eyes and take the shot yourself. Leave her and the boy out of it." Through the crack of the door, Sarah glimpsed the pale outline of Holt, rifle lifted just enough to gleam against the fading light. His two men flanked him, shifting, restless, their faces young, uncertain. Holt barked a laugh. Brave talk from a broken man who hides in the woods. "Tell me, Colt, how many graves you digging out here to keep your ghosts company?" The words stung Sarah, though she didn't know why. She felt the weight of Colt's silence more than the insult. His back was straight, his rifle steady, but his scars seemed to pull taut across his face. Shadows cutting deep around his eyes. One of Holt's men spoke, his voice uneasy. "Holt, maybe we ought to let this be. It's just a woman and a babe." But Holt's answer was a backhanded shove, the man stumbling sideways with a curse. "Number nobody spits in my eye and walks away. Not him, not her." The tension stretched, so thick it felt like a rope about to snap. Sarah couldn't stand it. Fear rattled her bones, but something stronger rose beneath it, something that had carried her through hunger, through shame, through endless nights praying her boy wouldn't die before morning. She stepped to the door and pushed it open just enough for her voice to carry. "Stop this." Her cry shook, but it cut the night. "I came here because I had nowhere else. If it's me you want, then take me. Leave him out of it." Colt half turned, shock flickering across his scarred face, but Holt's grin spread wide. "There she is. Brave little mouse. Maybe I will." His rifle angled toward her chest. The moment cracked. Colt moved. Not reckless, but with the precision of a man who'd faced death too many times to flinch now. His rifle barrel swung, his voice steel. "You raise that gun at her again, Holt, and I swear it'll be the last thing you ever do." The air tightened, every man's finger brushing trigger, every breath drawn sharp. The baby stirred, a soft whimper floating out into the night like the world's cruelest reminder of what was at stake. Sarah froze, her body aching to shield him, her heart pounding loud enough to drown the fire's crackle. For a long moment, no one moved. Holt's eyes glittered mean, but behind him, his men shifted again. Doubt deeper this time. One muttered, low but firm, "He's right, Holt. This ain't worth it." The sneer faltered. Holt spat into the dirt, his anger curdled into something darker. "You'll regret this, Colt. You both will." Then he lowered his gun slow, stepping back. His men followed, relief plain in the slope of their shoulders. Only when their shapes vanished into the night did Colt breathe. He lowered his rifle, his hands shaking so slightly Sarah almost missed it. He turned, eyes locking on her, something unspoken heavy between them. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. Holt's retreat was no surrender. It was a promise. The dawn broke pale and brittle, washing the cabin in light that felt more like a warning than a blessing. Sarah stood at the window, the baby warm against her chest, watching the tree line with eyes that hadn't closed all night. Colt had barely moved either, his rifle never leaving his lap, the fire burning low and steady like a heartbeat refusing to quit. She wanted to believe Holt had slunk off for good, but the silence outside didn't feel safe. It felt waiting. The sound came sudden, a branch cracking, too sharp to be the wind. Colt was on his feet instantly, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, but Sarah could see the truth written in the hard line of his jaw. Holt was back. The door shuttered before the first knock even came. Not polite, not hesitant, a battering ram of fists and boots rattling the hinges. Colt shifted Sarah and the baby behind him, then pulled the door open in one sharp motion, rifle leveled. Holt filled the doorway, his face twisted with rage, hair wild, pistol already raised. "You think you can shame me in front of my men? You think you can steal what's mine?" His words spit like fire. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't realized until that moment what Holt wanted most. Not her, not the child. Control. To prove he could take anything. Colt didn't flinch. "She was never yours, Holt. You don't own people." His voice was steady, but Sarah saw the tremor in his scarred hand, the way every muscle in his body begged to fire. Behind Holt, one of his men appeared again, face pale, eyes shifting. "Holt, stop. This ain't right." But Holt swung the pistol toward him, snarling. "You open your mouth again, boy, and you'll choke on dirt." Sarah couldn't hold back. She stepped forward, clutching the baby close, her voice shaking but sharp as glass. "Enough. You think you scare me, Holt? You don't. I've lost everything already. You can't take more from me than life itself." The words stunned the room. For a heartbeat, Holt's arm wavered, thrown off balance by her defiance. Colt seized it. His rifle snapped up, shot cracking loud and final. The blast tore through Holt's shoulder, spinning him backward out the door. He hit the ground, screaming, pistol clattering useless into the dirt. His men froze. No one reached to help him. One by one, they turned away, disgust plain in their eyes. Holt writhed in the dust, clutching blood, shouting curses that carried hollow in the cold morning air. Colt lowered his rifle slow, the smoke curling like the last ghost leaving the room. He turned to Sarah, his face tight with exhaustion, but his eyes softening when they met hers. "It's over." Sarah shook her head, tears streaking down her cheeks, the baby stirring against her. "No, it's not over, but maybe it can begin again." For the first time, Colt's shoulders eased. He reached, careful, almost afraid, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered there, warm and real, a promise without words. Together they stepped outside, the cabin behind them still standing, the fire still burning. Holt lay in the dirt, broken and alone, his men already vanished into the trees. The world felt raw, scraped clean by violence, but alive. Sarah looked at the horizon, then at Colt, then down at the child whose tiny hand gripped her dress. She whispered, not to Holt, not even to Colt, but to herself. "We're not ghosts anymore." Colt's arm settled around her, steady and certain. The cabin wasn't much, the scars weren't gone, and tomorrow's hunger would still come. But in that morning light, they weren't alone. For the first time, they weren't alone.